Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today, all the way from France, is Lynn Bell. Lynn, thank you so much for being here.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm very happy to be speaking to you, Mychal.
Lynn, well, I'm super excited to be speaking to you, and I'm also deeply excited to go into the conversation that we're going to be having today. But for those of you who this is your first time here joining us here on the Oraculos podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers from all around the world who aren't just changing their own lives through their astrological practice, but they're also greatly impacting this field of astrology that we all know and love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos podcast, give yourself a moment, go down below and like this video from now because it's going to be amazing. But also subscribe to the Oraculos podcast on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever we are, and share this podcast with your other astrologically minded friends so that more and more people around the world can know about these amazing conversations we're having with these amazing astrologers like Lynn Bell. So, Lynn, once again, I'm really excited to be speaking with you right now because you and I, we've spoken quite a bit off air about our common interests and our shared history, not just with astrology, but also with some of the tangential subjects that have led us into astrology. So before we really dive into the astrological component of things, tell us a little bit about you, Lynn, who you are, how do you end up in France, and also how you ended up practicing the specific branch of astrology that you practice today.
Well, I grew up in Chicago, and I was someone with a very hungry mind and a natural attraction to the mythic, and which took more basic forms when I was growing up. And I also needed to understand my environment. I was looking for something that would make sense of what I was experiencing. And when I was about 12 or 13, and I think that this is common for a lot of us, that first Jupiter return, something wakes up. I started paying more attention to horoscopes and asking people their signs and their birthday. And I had a very good memory, so I remembered the birthdays of once you told me, I knew. And I found that this started to help me make sense of the world around me. Now, I didn't get deeply interested in astrology because it didn't exist around me. I used to buy little horoscope rolls out of a gumball machine. You could buy your monthly horoscope for the signs, and I would spend some of my allowance on that. And then I would find books that would give me moon position or Venus position. But this, until I was probably 22, I never met anyone who knew more about astrology than I did. So, which sounds extreme. And because I couldn't find information about astrology, I discovered books on palmistry and taught myself palmistry. And I found that I had these very strong results with people, which were a little spooky. And I used to, when I was at university, I did palmistry to raise money for charity or something. And people would line up. And but when I did that, I found that I got a little bit burnt out, emptied out. And I realized quite young that if I were going to do something where I was actually connecting with another person's larger field, let's say, that I needed something with more distance or space between me and the other. So I understood that probably by the time I was 18. Now, I never intended to be an astrologer. Never. But it would not leave me alone. I had a crisis when I was about 20, a sort of spiritual crisis, looking at the night sky, saying, I'll never be able to understand the entire universe. I'll never be able to take it in. And I thought, there's no point in finishing my studies, because why bother when you can't know everything, when the universe is fundamentally unknowable? But I was talked into continuing, and I started a PhD program. But the entire time I was doing the PhD, I was like, all I wanted to do was learn esoterics. And so I took a leave of absence after a first year and completely dove into everything, which had already been part of my trajectory. From the I Ching to Hindu mysticism to, I met Muktananda, I heard Ali Akbar Khan in concert, met magicians from the Golden Dawn. People appeared on my path once that path became a path that was just driving me in a way. All kinds of people appeared. So that's the path beyond astrology. But astrology was always the central weave, always moving in and out.
I almost had tears come to my eye when you spoke about looking out at the vastness of the night sky and realizing that you'll never know everything about the universe. And I think that that's something that I've struggled with as well at a younger age and also at my current age. I would like to think that I navigate those waters a bit more in a better way, but I don't know. I think that this is also what I really enjoy speaking with you off air. This similarity in terms of we were drawn into this wider esoteric field with a hunger and the yearning and the craving, essentially, to know the theory of everything, to know the spiritual and the cosmic underpinnings of everything. And I think that if you genuinely set out with that as your specific intention in life, you do ultimately come to this place, this precipice of realization that I'll never know everything. I will exhaust this body and 10 others, and I still won't know everything. I'll come back again 20 times, and I still won't know everything. So I honor the nostalgia and the angst in that sentiment because I think it's something that we still have to live with, and we still have to find some sense of solace around, even as we continue to try to fill that. Do you feel as if you've fully filled that within yourself now, or do you feel as if that's still an itch beneath the surface for you?
It's different. From that time, it morphed in a way, because I understood in some ways that crisis was about knowing with the rational mind, knowing with the gathering mind. Like reading, when I was young, I tried to read every book in the library in the children's section. And I got to, it's a certain temperament. And I got to M, and there were these really boring authors I didn't like that had written all kinds of books. So I said, no, I don't have to do that. And, but that's a lot of books. But the thing is that the way of knowing shifted, right? And astrology is a way of knowing. And working with clients, we step into a way of connecting to the language of symbolism and to the energetic of the person in front of us. And everything we've studied or learned, all our work moving those symbols in our mind and seeing their endless permutations helps us to know in a different way, right? So my focus, I think that crisis, which was a very profound crisis, made me look for a different way in, not the multiplicity of knowing, not the knowing everything, but the following a particular path of knowing. Because if we can do that, okay, and I think that is what excites people about astrology, is that astrology suddenly reveals things saying, oh my, how does this work? We still don't know, of course, but how here we have something where we find what people are living, who they are, the choices they're making, what they're becoming, following these patterns and force lines. And it's the knowing of that, the following the thread of each life, which is a different kind of knowing and a privilege. Okay, when you touch the life of a client and you start to work with them and follow what's moving, whether they're moving psychologically or moving into just awareness of who they may be and who they could become. This is an incredible place to live, I think.
I love the fact that you mentioned the endless permutations of the symbolic landscape of this astrology of ours. And I'm curious as to what influences, whether they be authors or teachers or even a personal study of yours, what influences have informed your relationship to the symbolic field of astrology and your own interpretation of astrological symbolism?
Oh, that's a good question. What influences? Well, first, I mean, I started to read Jung in my last year of university for an independent study. And at the time I was dreaming like crazy. So my own dreams and the way I looked to make sense of those dreams, so the dream language. I don't dream as often now. And then understanding there had already been work done on making sense of this, the whole world of archetypes. But then another influence, I read Carlos Castaneda when all of those books came out. And that whole idea of seeing the world around us as alive, as full of force, was very important. I read a lot of the esoteric books of theosophy, like many of us. And Rudolf Steiner was a particular influence for me at a certain point. I read dozens of his books, which I couldn't possibly read one now, but that whole idea of actually seeing what's beyond visible perception, right? And of course, I studied many different symbolic systems, but I live in Europe, which is filled with art. And I grew up in Chicago, which has one of the great museums in the world. And one of the things I did in the summers was go to the museums and take in these incredible images. And I'm sure that they influenced me really deeply. It's something I love to do. I'm always finding things that I often put in my lectures to illuminate things that I see, that I'm thinking about. They stimulate me.
I love this artistic landscape that you reference in terms of your own relationship to astrology, as well as people like Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung and Carlos Castaneda and these other spiritual influences. Because what I find is that the astrologers who I speak to who really have this deep connection to their astrology are astrologers who also have a deep connection to humanity and to the humanities as a subject area. And similarly, I find that astrologers, particularly younger astrologers who come into astrology specifically only studying astrology, like I'm only going to study astrology textbooks, I'm only going to study within this specific field, the astrology doesn't feel as connected to their larger relationship to humanity, as does the astrologers who have other studies in fields that may be considered tangential. You know, Carl Jung isn't necessarily astrological, but he does speak deeply to the heart of our human experience. So my point in saying this is that I have always found, and for myself, particularly with my own practice of astrology, that it's been of the utmost value to study non astrological fields and know that even those things weave back in to the astrology that I practice, because it makes it more connected to life, not just this pristine astrology that's over there on the pedestal, but when we study other things around astrology and use it to inform our astrology, art, poetry, music, dance, yoga,
Yes.
everything, it creates a more heartfelt relationship.
Well, I agree with you absolutely, Mychal. And I was a literature student. So of course, literature, I think, is great training for astrology because because people's lives have a narrative, have we actually help give the mythic narrative, or help reveal it when we talk to another person. It's not just about an astrologer knowing something for the other. It really is touching more deeply a movement in the other's lives. Now, this brings us to psychology because, and I think when we talk about astrology as an art, this is extremely important. That's why dance, I think as a human being, everything I've done goes into my astrology. Whether if I do yoga or dance, as you say, um, I when I first started seeing clients, I probably did my first readings when I was about 21. And, you know, I was still making technical errors, I'm sure. But there was quickly something there, a kind of, and when I did astrology, someone, I was traveling and wondering and wondering what I was going to do and resisting the path of astrology. And I had a very important conversation with someone who is not at all mystical, but said, you must do, but who created a career out of nothing, basically, a very powerful career, and who said, what is it you love? What's the thing you love most? And I said, well, when I do I love astrology, and there's something that happens when I do astrology that just doesn't happen anywhere else. And it was in answering that question that I understood that something was was the path that opened to me, and that I needed to really commit to. Um, and I'm a passionate person. Now, I also, when I first moved to France, I was living in this, you wanted to ask me how I got to France, I think. But anyway, when I first moved to France, I was living in this, you know, fourth floor walk up, but it felt like 6 floors, in a building built in probably in the 1600s, right? And it's this little attic that my clients would have to, with no elevator, that my clients would have to, in what is now a very chic neighborhood. But everybody lived like this at the time. And I would, at that time, I was very mystical, and I had a lot of mystical experiences in my early days in Paris when I didn't know many people. And everything was connected to this inner and mystical language that I was learning. Okay? And at that time, I had these dreams where I actually went to school in my dreams, and I have memories of them where I'd be shown geometric figures and colors. And I think it was when I knew enough astrology that whatever happens in your dreams was actually starting to consolidate on a completely different level. And at that time, I felt my knowledge. So again, this difference between knowing, different forms of knowing. I felt I was experiencing initiation where what I had learned with my mind dropped into my body on a more integrated level. So it wasn't always an easy period on a personal level. I was very poor. You know, I barely earned enough money to pay my not very expensive rent. And I didn't have much heat in my apartment, that kind of thing. So,
I think I've heard you refer to it as a matchbox at one point in time. You were giving a lecture on solar returns, and you were speaking about your apartment, and in the same sort of way, but you characterized it as a matchbox, I think.
well, these days, actually, it would be, it's about 3 times bigger than what a lot of students live in Paris these days. So these days, it was actually it would be considered pretty generous as a space. But yes.
So, Lynn, how do you think we can teach this newer generation of astrologers coming in this wider perspective of astrology? Because I think that it's important for people coming into the field to still specifically learn astrology, because that's what they're coming for, that's what they're paying for. And it's important that we create, or it's important that we impart an actual solid system of astrology for people to work through. But this other thing, this non-tangible mystical component that enlivens, how do you think we can go about teaching that to our students and to the newer generation of astrologers in a way where it's obvious that this thing still ties into the astrology?
Okay, I'm going to give you 2 answers to that question. The first answer is that I think every astrologer always needs a system of personal work on themselves, where they're questioning themselves and using what they discover in astrology as a reverb, to find out more about who they are, to see their blind spots, to see what works, what doesn't work. Now, some astrologers, there are different paths to divine knowledge, but astrology is, by definition, connected to something larger than we are. So if you're really paying attention to astrology and not using, I think sometimes it can be a temptation to use astrology to feed your ego, right? To create a personality, you know. And I mean, we're not astrologers by accident. So, you know, I mean, I think that most of us have to acknowledge that there is something of that in us. When I taught for this CPA, the Center for Psychological Astrology in London, created by Liz Green, the very brilliant Jungian analyst and astrologer who many people will know through her books. Liz actually made it a requirement for students in the program to be in therapy. Now, and they didn't say what kind of therapy, but basically they would present some kind of work where the emotions and the issues that came up as you went deeply into astrology actually had a place to go. Now, I don't think that's the only way for an astrology student. I mean, we were doing specifically psychological astrology, but I also had a group in Paris. I created an association with a friend of mine here, and we did supervision groups with 6 people, and people would bring charts and bring issues, and we discuss what came up. So, and a lot can feed into that. So that's an answer about students, right? But the answer about the mystical, the larger path, I think that is inherent in astrology. If you get caught by astrology, it's because the synchronicity, the magic, and the mystery are calling you. They've revealed themselves to you. And so that mystery is something you're following, and it's echoing the mystery of who we are all, who we are, who each one of us is, but on many levels, right? So there's the first level, who am I? What's going to happen to me? Who will I meet? Then there's another level of what am I here to do? What is my purpose? What are the things that are stopping me from being who I am supposed to be? So I'm very interested in those levels. I think what psychological astrology is interested in those levels of, I can see I'm meant to be this, but things are keeping me from getting there. So how do I start looking at the chart to reveal to me those things that are getting in the way or impeding me? And what are the moments when that might open up or shift or be revealed?
Lynn, one of the things that has been said about psychological astrology, and I think that it's been said by people of a more traditional perspective, is that there's a space at which psychological astrology becomes pure psychology and not necessarily an integration of psychology and astrology. How do you feel you navigate this relationship to these two fields within your own practice so that the astrology is still essentially front and center? Or is there a way how you navigate that allows you to balance the psychological perspective as well as the astrological perspective in a way where both of those things get their due diligence?
Those are great questions. And again, I think each psychological astrologer has a different answer to them. So my answer doesn't represent psychological astrology. It represents my practice. I could have easily become a therapist, and I have therapeutic training. And I always chose not to do that because I see myself as an astrologer. Okay. Those are two different things. One of the reasons for this, on a personal level, is therapy is constructed as a long-term, ongoing relationship with someone. When I have a client, as I did recently, who I could tell really needed an ongoing relationship, I immediately referred to, he said, I would like to do several sessions with you. I immediately referred him to a very gifted therapist who I knew would be a good fit for him. But he's also working with me. He just wrote me back and said, I've done 3 sessions with this person, and I want to do more sessions with you and see things from an astrological perspective. And over the years, I've had many therapists send me their clients when they're stuck, when they're plateauing, so that we can, because the astrology will work that way. Now, at the same time, I think one of the gifts of astrology is, especially when someone is going through major transits, is they don't necessarily need therapy. That is a personal choice, right? But what they need is someone who can take them deeply into the issues that are described by the symbolic interaction of the planet and touch those issues. Now, I know that things are moving. For example, in trauma therapy, a trauma therapist will say, do not touch that. Don't go there. if the person mentions it. So if someone comes to me and says, I had a trauma, I will send their chart. There's a very powerful indication that at the age of 11, there's an experience of this kind, right? We all do this. And the person might say, oh, I can't think of anything, but, and then they might call me a few days later saying, I had completely forgotten, or I talked to someone in my family, and this is what you were seeing, and that makes so much sense. So we can give information to a person that's very useful for them, that unravels stuck places that are often revealed by difficult aspects in the chart. Like if you say to someone, okay, I have Mars square Saturn, I have 2 malefics in a difficult aspect. Okay, I'm not a psychological astrologer who's going to say, every aspect has its positive sides, although I do believe that. I think that's, that's ridiculous. I mean, Mars square Saturn is a difficult aspect in a chart. And acknowledging that for someone, acknowledging that you will have to go through something that is more, there are periods in your life where you will be asked to make much more effort or deal with greater obstacles than other people. And perhaps when that aspect was exact, when you was, let's say by solar arc at 7 years of age, as your first experience of this, how do you then learn choice around an aspect that is difficult and that gives a difficult task for a lifetime? And I'm very interested in getting underneath so that the person, rather than feeling bound by that aspect, feels honored to have that aspect, honored to be given the task.
That's a very special viewpoint, because I don't think that I have heard that within traditional circles. I've been trained as a medieval Renaissance astrologer as well as a Uranian astrologer. So I have these very specific viewpoints that I interact with astrology from. But I love the soft landing of that, and that a hard aspect is something that is an honor to be given because it allows you the opportunity for growth, or it allows you the opportunity to have a very specific gift of an experience that you probably wouldn't have had you had a different sort of configuration. So I love that. And I don't even think that I've heard that within psychological astrology circles, even though I haven't really interacted with psychological astrology in that way. But there's this concept of being honored and being gifted the sorts of charts that we have. I think it changes just how we live with astrological language. And I think it's also very beneficial and helpful, because I always say to people that it doesn't matter how good you are at something, but are you helpful? Can you help a person heal? Like that really is the sign of someone being a good astrologer for me. And I honor the helpfulness that I feel within what you just said.
Thank you. It just made me think, I mean, I don't know if I've expressed it in exactly those words before either, but what I've noticed with, for example, the clients I have with that aspect is some people are able to use it to accomplish extraordinary things, and some people are not. Okay, and again, there is no judgment involved in that. There is a kind of witnessing of what the person is carrying in them. Sometimes your client just needs something to be witnessed, and sort of um, and say this is coming. And I mean, I love the approach of Hindu astrologers who will give you remedies or tasks. Once I had a dinner at an Indian restaurant about a block from the Seine in Paris with a group of Danish astrologers, one of whom was a Hindu astrologer. And he said he had something coming up in his chart where he had to invite, the remedy was to invite a group of astrologers for a meal on the banks of the Ganges. And he said, well, since a group, Brahmins, and he said, well, all astrologers are Brahmins in India. And every river is connected. So we're having the meal on the banks of the Seine, and he invited us all out to dinner. And I love this idea that by acting in a certain way, you're releasing something that would otherwise be a binding of fate. And one of the things I would say to those who do traditional astrology, who I have huge respect for, I think there is a lot of astrology being unearthed and discovered that had been lost and forgotten, where, it's like in some ways 20th century astrologers were blindfolded, finding their way and reinventing things, but also wildly creative. And that should not be thrown away either. But having this idea, okay, you have this difficult thing. What is it asking of you in your chart? And this is where psychological or spiritual astrology is very powerful. But when I listen to people who are only interested in prediction, I mean, that has always been very disturbing for me. Of course, when I was a young astrologer, I probably would have used the adjective humanist early on to describe what I did. And I became very close to a group of humanist astrologers in France, the Réseau d'Astrologie Humaniste, which was created by Alexander Ruperti. I also know traditional French astrologers very well. So I've absorbed the French tradition, which Morin de Villefranche. I've absorbed the modern French astrologers, André Barbeau in particular, in his great work on mundane astrology, which I have infinite admiration for. And I recognized myself first and most profoundly in Liz Green's work, and had a powerful first encounter with her at a conference in Switzerland in 1980, 81. I don't actually remember the exact date, but I remember she was lecturing on the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, upcoming Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and what it might mean. And I've never, actually, it was the first time that I felt I had gone as deeply into astrology with someone that I wanted to go. And it was a revelation for me and a joy. And that's how astrology moves me, right? It moves me in the underpinning. I'm the outer events that happen. And of course, like all astrologers, I've had, I think astrology is a tool, like all esoteric tools, that opens up our intuition. And the more you use it, it works on us. We become the instrument of this art, right? And if we're lucky, we play our instrument incredibly well, but we always play the instrument with another. We don't play it for ourselves. We're actually stepping into the field of the other. I think this is incredibly important. That's why inner work is so fundamental. But inner work can be a meditation practice. But I think it's also important to have connection with those who are wiser than we are, in the body or out of the body.
I've recently found myself becoming rather, I'm looking for a word that contains the proper sensitivity, but I've recently found that my relationship to traditional astrology proper has shifted considerably, and I'm reclaiming a lot of the wider esoteric and spiritual practices of my past and bringing them into the foray and into the fold of my practice of traditional astrology so that it's not primarily just traditional astrology. And sometimes I go very far in the past and I resurrect the pre-Socratics in their search for the theory of everything, because I find that that serves as a very potent underpinning for our understanding of how our astrology was formed, and that creates an internal sense of beauty and desire and longing, this ancient quest to find the theory of everything before philosophy even existed as a proper subject. Like that gives me inspiration and this romanticization of of how my astrology fits into the world. But I think when I'm operating, or when I've operated specifically and purely within a traditional perspective, I've often found that it has felt dry, and it has felt as if there's been a performative element, this element of being right all of the time. And that I at this moment in my life trying to undo and trying to step away from, because it's very easy for me to go into that role of the performative predictor who says things for the purpose of being right, not necessarily for the purpose of being helpful. And I find that softness when in this conversation, for example, and I found that soft space in my interaction with other modern astrologers. And I think it's very important that we honor that softness as well as we may want to honor the rigor of our field. But this soft landing space that we find within perspectives like psychological astrology and even evolutionary astrology, my heart is opened to that a lot now, and meeting people who identify as evolutionary astrologers because they have something and they have a languaging that isn't in traditional astrology. And that languaging that they have has the ability to mirror more of my own eclectic spiritual background that isn't just purely astrological. So I completely agree with you that there's something very important about resurrecting the astrology of the ancient world. But at the same time, we have grown so much, our perspective has grown so much, our view of the cosmos has grown so much, and so too must our approach to astrology.
Yeah. I think that's, you know, that idea of the one who knows and the one who is right. I mean, it is, um, again, in the language of one of the Native American traditions, um, knowing is an enemy. There's a certain moment where being right, your gift will trap you, I think. And that's, there's a certain kind of personality, you know, that that you and I belong to clearly. I hope people are still following us. I feel like I'm slightly high talking to you, Mychal. we're you ask questions that kind of take me to another place.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing. But it's true that there is, I'll tell you something I experienced when I was having my Neptune square Neptune. I went through, I'm a 12th house sun natally. And so I go through periods where I have a lot of energy, but I also don't. And if I overdo it, I will burn out. So I was working all the time. I was starting to do workshops every weekend and seeing clients constantly. And I was always working, and then I'd go out and see friends and have dinner and party. And so one day I had a dream that the tires of my bicycle were flat. And both tires. And I thought, oh, oops. And indeed, I was really, there was nothing really wrong with me, but I understood that I needed to take time, and I decided to take a 3-month sabbatical. And a lot of things were happening in my life around this time. I met incredible people. Yeah, it was almost as if the universe set up a redirection. And on the sabbatical, I traveled to Indonesia, and I traveled to these really faraway islands and things like that. And I didn't tell people, I stopped telling people I was an astrologer. I'd just say, oh, I'm a consultant, or I teach, or, nobody cared anyway. They're on some mythic trip. And I've always often used travel as a way to refine the flow in my life, especially solo travel. Be it traveling on your own, not knowing where you're going, who you're going to meet, what conversation you're going to have. For me, those experiences are very powerful at different times. And towards the end of this trip, I arrived in Java, and somebody said, oh, there's this spiritual teacher here named so-and-so. So I went to see this spiritual teacher, and he said to me, oh, I know an astrologer. He's one of my students, Alan Oken. Do you know him? And the way he said it was he pulled spiritual rank on me. And I was like, I felt my astrologer come up. I hadn't used my astrologer for about 2.5 months. And it came up like really powerfully. And I was like, who do you think you are? Do you have any idea? And it was so interesting to me because I actually felt that part of me where I identified, my ego identified with a kind of power. And it was so great. It was one of the best moments in my life because I realized I'd taken it off like a suit of clothes and that I didn't have to put it on in the same way. And see, but I think that if you're an astrologer or an alchemist or a esoteric teacher, there will be a moment where you have to have that encounter with yourself, right? I know this isn't the beginning of the astrological path that I'm talking about, but in a way, I'm addressing what you just talked about, Mychal, that idea that we do, and I could see this guy doing all these tricks to show me that he was more spiritually advanced or powerful than me. And it was like watching a performance. I had already met someone who I really did consider a spiritual teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. And that was a very powerful encounter for me. And I think, again, this is something I heard Stephen Forrest say recently in a talk, that it's just really important to recognize those that we've learned from, whether we've learned dance or painting or writing, those who have truly opened up something in us, and really bow to them.
I've come to the same realization, and you're right, we're not talking about the beginning of the astrological path at all. We're talking about something a little bit further down the rabbit hole. But I too have come to this place of realizing that I don't always want to wear the role of astrologer, shaman, priest, jungle physician, all of the articulations, all of these articulations of what being an astrologer means in the parts of the world where I am, but also of what being an astrologer means within my larger connection to spirituality and spiritual lineage. And sometimes, particularly recently, I have found myself asking myself, do I want to be on all the time? Do I want to stand in this space all the time? Are there not other things that I love doing? Are there not other things that inform my humanity? Do I always want to show up as healer and teacher and mystic and prophet and all of these things? And it's been a very interesting thing for me to navigate that. And you took a 3 month sabbatical. I, at the moment, have taken several of those over the last 4 months. And where I am right now in life, I need to be working, so I cannot take that sabbatical right now. But I find it interesting how sometimes we do need to sleep a night without the armor of our astrological self still being on. And sometimes that sleep takes a week, sometimes that sleep takes a month, but sometimes we do have to separate ourselves from that so that we can experience something else within us that can allow us to know that, hey, that is actually a role that you step into, but it doesn't necessarily have to be who you are 24/7.
Right. Well, it's so interesting. I was recently interviewing a French colleague of mine for the English Astrological Journal. And he was saying he's somebody who's been an astrologer since he was 15 and put on the conferences here. And has done a huge contribution to taught astrology. So, but I said to him, he said to me, well, I'm not sure I'm an astrologer. I've never thought of myself as an astrologer. And I said, well, maybe you need to redefine what that is. He said, I'm a researcher and a sociologist and have a degree in anthropology. And I've always kind of felt like I looked at astrology from outside. I said, but you're just reinventing the definition. So I think that's important, is that we need, whether you're on the beginning of the astrological path or in the middle, or you've been doing it for a lifetime, you can redefine what that is. It doesn't have to be so tight, right? There's astrology is a performance art. Like if you're not able to give your clients what they're looking for, they're not going to come to you. But and I've never equated psychology, to go back to the question about psychology. I don't think astrology, I think I studied with some brief therapy. Okay. And brief therapy is a form of therapy where people might just come for 2 or 3 sessions, right? Which, of course, goes counter the economic model, major economic model of life dependency on your Freudian analyst, which most people don't do anymore. But having myself done a fairly long analysis and then done ongoing work off and on throughout my life with other people, because I understand that when I reach a block, knowing about the block may not be enough to change it or transform it. And there are different ways of doing this. I think that many people there are different pathways to the self, basically. But I think astrology is a pathway to the self, and that what we are doing when we do readings is basically dialoguing with the other's path. We're intersecting with their path. And we may just be giving them useful clues for the next thing coming up in their life. And already that's a great thing to be able to do. We may be giving them useful clues or useful information about not falling into a major trap, right? One of the things I find very interesting in astrology is our information we can give clients about children, for example, and marriage. Let's say they have difficult signatures in those areas of life. How do you deal with that, Mychal?
Well, that's a wonderful question because I just had an example of that yesterday. And in the past, when I was young, dumb, and full of enthusiasm, it was much more pertinent within my heart to be correct than to be helpful.
Mm.
So I have, in proper traditional fashion, just given people the news, which has in many cases, thank the universe, has more often been spot on than it hasn't. And at the same time, I found myself afterwards wondering, was that helpful? Was it really the most helpful thing? And yesterday, I had a client um, who I had a call with, who the chart was in the front of us. We were looking at her life in planetary terms, and she said, my love life really is non existent. Will I have a love life? Like, will I ever have a boyfriend? Will I ever find love? Or what does the chart say? And from a traditional perspective, from a purely traditional perspective, the pure answer would have been no. Because that's just what it was. I mean, yeah. However,
Saturn or
yeah, it was a rough situation. However, I realized that in that moment, someone coming and asking, "Will I ever have a love life?" Even though they may have reconciled themselves to the thought that they may never have a love life, it's not a helpful thing to say to a person, even if within our tight knit traditional astrological enclave, we may say, oh, wow, here's a chart of a person who will never have a love life. That's not something to that's not something to tell a person. So I turned that into a counseling moment. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist. That's a part of my practice. That's a part of my spectrum of possibilities within my realm. And so I said, well, where do you feel inhibited in terms of your relationship to relationships, and why has this constantly been a theme within your life? And so we developed a range of inquiry around that and around her relationships to friendships and how she's been through awful friendships before, and because of some of the major letdown and crises that she's had within her friendships, she's superimposed that onto her and her pursuit of love and her feeling as if she doesn't have a voice when these people leave her life. And so it became this much richer, much more textured moment of humanity that the astrology served as a launching pad for, because now, after we were able to identify specific areas in her life that have admittedly sucked in the past, where people have let her down or friendships have ended suddenly, then we were able to really talk about this love consideration in a new way. And the questioning became, now, what would happen if you let go of this? Or what would happen if you transformed your relationship to this story? Whereas this no longer became something that you had to hold on so deeply to as a point of identification. I'm a person who people leave. I'm a person who people let down. What happened if we change that? And she said, well, I'd feel freer. I'd have a voice. And it just became this solution oriented moment that my humanity prepared me to facilitate, but not necessarily my astrology. And so,
is what this that was a brief therapy session.
yeah, exactly.
Did you train in Ericksonian hypnosis
I
or
trained in Ericksonian
yeah,
hypnosis, and I trained in Gestalt therapy as well, and I trained in Gestalt dream work. And
right.
so, yes,
Well, I trained in Ericksonian hypnosis too. So that was back in the late 80s.
that was before I was born.
And again, I think, but I think now I've identified something, because I actually did feel at one point that I was in a trance while we were talking. So you know how you use your voice and your pacing, and of course that's part of your journalistic gift too. But it is true that if you understand how, I think it is important for people to understand and I think this is particularly important for traditional astrologers, is what are you seeding in a person's psyche when you make a prediction? And again, is that helpful or not helpful? So there's a lot of how it's not that you're not right. Okay, about, again, as you say, I can look at a chart and I think, well, it's very unlikely this person is going to have children. So I'll ask them, especially, let's say, a woman in her mid-30s with strong certain signatures. And I do also want to add to that, that there are signatures that, for example, around infertility, but that now have solutions that didn't exist in the past. And so it's also very important that astrologers realize that, you know, things that might have indicate death or accident or illness will not indicate that in the modern era, because there are solutions that did not exist 2000 years ago. So anyway, I also just need to put that in there. But going back to the psychology of what we seed with our communication, everyone knows about self-fulfilling prophecies. And many people have asked me about that. And people have actually, even if I try to be careful, sometimes people said, in French, people say, Lynn, tu m'as annoncé que. Now, I would never, that means, Lynn, you predicted that this would arrive. Now, first of all, I try not to predict in a closed form where there is no choice. But I usually say, if you continue this way, I think this could happen. However, this is a moment where you have some choice in this, so that could open up the situation into different possibilities. I mean, and this is the kind of language that I very often use. And what you were talking about with your client, how can you have a helpful conversation? It's true that if someone believes, you know, I mean, I've dealt with astrologers. I have a client who went to see the great astrologer Andre Barbeau, and I've talked about this example before. And she said to me, well, Andre told me I might die when I'm 72. And I said, well, that's kind of shocking. And I said, well, I can see why he would say that. And then afterwards, she said to me, she said, you know, I didn't die that year, but the business I had with my ex-husband was sold, and I left Paris and moved to another country, to the south of France. And then I started to spend half my years between India and France. And she said, nothing happened, but in a way it was like the old self was gone. So Andre was right. And do you know, and I love, I mean, she's the generosity of the client, who in the meantime, you know, had asked me about this many times. And I said, well, you know, that's one possible interpretation. And never, I mean, another astrologer is always going to say something for a reason that we may be able to reconstruct. But clearly it created trauma for this person to carry this, right? So I think for traditional astrologers, it's really great to learn helpful communication and to learn skilled communication. And that is where psychology can enter in. Now, there's a certain kind of psychological communication that makes me crazy, you know, which is just like, oh, this happened and this person, because your mother did this. This is not psychological astrology. It has nothing to do with, do you know, there is a kind of fantasy about what psychology is, which has nothing to do with what psychology is. So I also need to say.
Well, I definitely appreciate your perspective on this concept of integrating more helpful language into our astrological field. And it's something that, for me, I appreciate the concrete possibilities that I get from my traditional astrology practice, but I also appreciate being able to wrap that concreteness in softness and something that doesn't just feel like a verdict or a judgment over someone's life. And as I grow older, having grown with astrology for a humongous chunk of my life, coming into it at around the age of 11, 12 as well, and now, being 28, I've grown my bones in a very specific way. And now I'm really taking advantage of existing without armor, this armory of tradition, and allowing the spiritual and the esoteric and the humane parts of my larger spiritual practice to inform the astrology that I practice. And I'm also trying to impart that to my students as well, so that while they are strong and rigorously trained in whatever it is I have to teach them, they're also bringing in this larger aspect of the humanities to be able to hold humane space, not just astrological space, but humane space for others. And I feel as if that's something that you've cultivated within your practice as well.
Yeah, and that's what I think. And I think that in the, as I've gotten, everything I've done in my life kind of flows into my astrological practice. So, I had my analytic period, like, whereas I actually kind of liked my astrology better when I was just mystical than my analytic period, and then I did my hypnosis training, and then I had the Buddhist perspective, Buddhist practice, and many, many other encounters and practices. And what you're saying, I'm tired sometimes of being the prophet and the astrologer and the teacher. And I was thinking about something that the Sufis do. Like, there are a lot of hidden Sufis, like people who are Sufi initiates, and then they're told, go open a grocery store. But you're not supposed to tell people that you're a teacher, right? So there are also those people out there that are invisible, okay, and that we can have periods of invisibility. I think the psychology of astrology is really like using astrology, using the incredible predictive gift. Like, I'm an astrologer. I'm not somebody who doesn't say, this happens, this is dangerous, this is a huge test for you, which you may not succeed at, and if this, it's, sometimes with my clients, I'll say, don't do that. I know I shouldn't do that, but sometimes I can't help myself. Or they'll do. I have clients who actually were signing for a new business under major Neptune transits, and I was like, "Could you just wait?" But I'd been telling them this for a year. I'm like, "Not now. Don't. Can you wait? No. We're going to eat." It was a Taurus client, actually, and my Taurus client said, but if we don't invest the money, we'll just be eating our capital. like this is a typical Taurian perspective. And I just said, well, and if you have to do it, but I would wait if I were you. And it turned out to be a disaster. But you cannot, as an astrologer, save people from their choices. They have to have their experiences. And that was very hard for me as a young astrologer, is that I felt bad when I hadn't helped somebody avoid a terrible relationship or hadn't seen a really powerful example of this, which is still a mystery to me, is that I worked with somebody for many years, and I did her husband's chart and her children's chart, and I said, there's something coming I don't like. And I looked at her husband's chart and I said, there's danger here. And he said and every year he went on a motorcycle trip with his buddies. And she said, well, should I tell him not to go on the trip? And I said, well, I don't know if you can really do that, but you need to, I don't know if I could go that far. Remember, I wasn't talking to him, I was talking to her. I said, but I'm not liking what I'm seeing here. And on that trip, her husband missed a turn on a road and his motorcycle went over the cliff. Now, in retrospect, I could see what I was feeling, but with people I love and care for, I have trouble giving bad news, right? And I don't see why that would be useful, if you like. But it was very hard for me. It was so painful for her. You can imagine she had 2 small children. And she loved her husband very much. And she said to me, he always said he didn't think he would live to be old. But I often thought, was there something I could have said, or was there something I could have done, or what I could have? I think this is very hard for us as astrologers, whether we're psychological astrologers or not. No astrologer wants to be right in that situation.
That is true.
But these are the mysteries of life. But we have been right in those situations. And the whole question is, I love it when clients come to me and say, do not talk to me about this. Say, great. Right?
Yep.
Right. But yeah. So I'm a psychological astrologer, but I also believe in fate. And anybody, I also would recommend, it's a difficult book for those who are interested in this subject. Again, Liz Green's book on the astrology of fate, where she considers some of these questions, right? What does it mean to have a handicapped child in a family? What does it mean to have a difficult life events? And how do you as an astrologer deal with this? And I think this is where the evolutionary and the Vedic perspectives are really helpful.
Lynn, this was really a deep conversation and a very special one for me as well, for many reasons, but also because I feel as if your own path in life has held so many of the same multiplicities that my life journey has held. And at times I found it difficult to articulate that to people because it seems like, oh my God, you do all of this and you've done all of this and you've studied palmistry and hypnotherapy and yoga and Reiki and you've been a ballet dancer and the list goes on and on. But as I've spoken to you today, it's made me feel as if all of that is okay. The fact that I can't put all the things I've done in my bio on my website is also okay because there's space for all of it, but it has all fed into me becoming an astrologer. And so thank you very much for sharing that.
Right. Well, I think for everyone who's listening, if you stay with us in this very particular conversation, I think you also will invent the kind of astrologer you are. And there isn't a cookie cutter type of astrologer. Even if you admire a particular astrologer and follow their teaching, even if you're Mychal's student, for example, or it is you. This is why it's an art. And in any art, each person who practices the art has their own way of bringing it to life. The science part, which is learning a rigorous traditional system or a rigorous modern system, or those learning the fundamentals and learning them well, and not just winging it with a few after having listened to a few lectures. I mean, so I had a wonderful student who told me she'd read 2 books and she was already doing readings for people on their transits, but she didn't know how to interpret a natal chart. And I was like, you cannot do that. I actually yelled at her. And she came back to me some months later and she said, I hated you. You were so mean. And she said, I thought about it and I knew you were right and I want to come and learn from you. So I was like, you cannot call yourself an astrologer that way. That is not good enough, right?
Yes.
And she was wonderful. I loved her. But she had all the potential in her, but but you become what's much more important than being an astrologer is to recognize that if you do astrologer, you are on a path of mystery and magic. And that path requires something from you. And it will also gift you with extraordinary things.
Well, Lynn, you've gifted me with an extraordinary conversation at 7 a.m., no less.
Very brave, Mychal. Thank you for being present at such an early hour and offering a space for a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you so much as well, Lynn. And Lynn, before we leave, if our listeners and viewers are wanting to get in contact with you for a consultation or to find out about your amazing books or anything else, how can they get in contact with you, Lynn?
Well, my website is www.astrology.com. I don't even know. And the best thing is to email me. You'll find my email on that site. And if you don't hear from me, just insist. I'm also on Facebook, where we started our initial conversations there.
Yes.
And yes, I do readings, and I love working with new clients.
Awesome, Lynn. So I'll put that contact information down below so that our listeners and viewers can reach out to you and experience your work more personally and more deeply.
Okay, fantastic. And there's a lot of lectures on my site as well, recordings of things I've done and information about things coming up. So, right.
Good stuff. Well, Lynn, once again, thank you so much for being here in this space. I truly appreciated it. And it was truly an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be able to be here and speak so deeply with you and to be in this moment of reflection with you. So thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you, Mychal.
And to our listeners and viewers out there, if this is your 100th time joining us here on the Oraculos podcast, or if this is time number 1, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to join in this virtual astrological space with us. I receive your encouragement, your love, your feedback, and your support. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos podcast, please do, yes, go down below and like this amazing video if you're watching it on YouTube, and also subscribe to the Oraculos podcast, and also share this amazing conversation with your other astrologically and magically minded friends, because more and more people around the world need to know about these amazing conversations that are being had with amazing astrologers like Lynn Bell. So until next time, I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, leaving you in peace and hope and love. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye. Lynn Bell.